Hello, my name is Bill Madro, and I'm head of Special Collections and University Archives here at Miami University. And I want to welcome everyone to our lecture series honoring Black History Month with today's presentation, Teaching Strategic Communications History Through Race, New Media, and Special Collections. I'd also like to recognize our co-sponsor, Miami University's Department of Media, Journalism, and Film. And on behalf of Miami University Libraries and Dean Jerome Conley, I want to thank them for their support. I also want to thank all those staff who helped organize this presentation, especially Miami University Archivist Jackie Johnson for planning this series. And now is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Dr. Adam Rottinghaus is the Assistant Professor of Strategic Communications in the Department of Media, Journalism, and Film. His research focuses on strategic communications and emerging technologies that blur business and consumer culture. For over 15 years, he has worked as a graphic designer and art director, specializing in print, web, and multimedia production, as well as marketing, strategy, and brand management. I will note that we used Dr. Rottinghaus' skills with our Bearing Witness exhibition here in Special Collections. Dr. Rottinghaus received his PhD in Communication Studies from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he has articles published in the International Journal of Communication and the Journal of Culture Economy. We also want to congratulate him on his latest book manuscript that traces contemporary branding and business-to-business marketing through a cultural history of technological exhibitions. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Adam Rottinghaus.
Thanks so much, Bill. I appreciate it. And huge thanks to Jackie for inviting me to share some of the work that I've been doing with strategic communication students in our collaborations with Special Collections. Just let me share. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the strategies that I've been employing in teaching students. So the talk, as Bill mentioned, is teaching strategic communications history through race, new media, and special collections. And I want to begin by talking about some recent events from last week. So on February 9th, Pepsi announced that Aunt Jemima would become Pearl Milling Company effective in June of this year. For those of you who are unaware of the corporate hierarchy, the Aunt Jemima brand is owned by Quaker, of like Quaker Oats, the oatmeal, which is owned by the parent company of PepsiCo. So this is why Pepsi is making an announcement about the pancake company. And so critics immediately have denounced it as an overreach of political correctness, disrupting a beloved brand icon, while advocates see it as an important step to equality, emphasizing the harmful effects that commercialized racist imagery have on Black communities. And it's the latter idea that is the subject of this talk. Brands and advertisements that surround us on a day-to-day basis have real effects on cultural life. So a press release, and for my students paying attention, this is from their press release on their website, that they said throughout the effort that led to the new Pearl Milling Company name, Quaker worked with consumers, employees, external cultural and subject matter experts, and diverse agency partners to gather broad perspectives and ensure the new brand was developed with inclusivity in mind. And the reason I want to start with that example is to highlight that strategic communication is an intervention into cultural politics. There's a really tight relationship there that we don't often think of as being sort of front and center. But these things such as branding, advertising, public relations, they are central to cultural life. And so when brands make moves like Aunt Jemima is changing to Pearl Milling, it says something about the way that we live our lives and the products that we use to live them. So when advertisers make decisions about where, how, and when to represent communities of people, the images, the words, and the ideas they choose, they reproduce or they transform the worldviews of their audience. And what I mean by that is, on one hand, it draws upon commonly circulating ideas and phrases and repackages them in the name of products. So in order for us to create an advertisement, our audience must first know and understand the words and the images. They must be familiar with the reference points that we're going to use when we're creating these messages. But the second part of that is that it amplifies, legitimizes, and reinforces these ideas as a way of communicating with audiences, simply by the fact that it's extended through a mass media platform or circulating on social media. Those messages are amplified and legitimized. So it really does come down to the images and the words, the ideas that we choose. They either can reproduce or they transform the worldview. And so the question we should ask is, are they reinforcing or are they challenging preconceived notions that audiences hold? And then what happens to those ideas over time? So as Bill said, I have a PhD in communication studies from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And for 15 years, I've been working in the industry. And I bring this up just to say that for the last 15 or so years, more than a decade, I've been studying the broader cultural work that we do in strategic communications and trying to teach some of those lessons to my students in order to equip them to succeed in a rapidly changing industry and having better critical frameworks to help them succeed in an industry and maybe help it operate in more just and equitable ways. And I say that because when I first started working in the industry right out of college, I had very few or very little critical frameworks to think about the broader effects of what I was doing. And so for the last few years, I've been collaborating with the Walter Havinghurst Special Collections and University Archives to create educational opportunities for my students so they can experience some of these historical materials and learn from the history of our industry. So the question is, what do we do with this history? It is really difficult to teach the history of advertising and PR without encountering what today appear as abhorrent, racist, sexist, and otherwise demeaning imagery that's used to sell products in really routine ways. And so in the introduction to the book, David Pilgrim's book, Understanding Jim Crow, Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. writes, there is healing power in participating in communal experiences steeped in sadness that cannot and must not be overlooked. Repression, conversely, robs us of a vocabulary for what we know is wrong. And in this book, Understanding Jim Crow, David Pilgrim, who is the founder of the Jim Crow Museum that's hosted at Ferris State University up in Michigan, he talks about what it's like to try to use these racist materials as a way to teach tolerance and promote social justice. And so Gates's introduction to the book really sets the stage about what the stakes are. And what I take away from his quote here is that we can't ignore it, and we have to find ways to move forward with it. And that means we have to account for this history. And so rather than just ignoring the nasty parts of the history, we have to find ways to work through it. One of those ways is what Pilgrim calls visual thinking strategies. And essentially, it's a way of facilitating small group discussions by beginning through asking general, non-threatening questions about the content of what they see. And I'll talk about what that looks like in one of the activities here in a little bit. But as a whole, like this leads me to ask, when we're looking at these materials, how do we make sense out of these images today? What lessons are to be drawn from them, and what can be applied to improve today's industry? And so I want to give you a proposition to begin with here, and that is that diversity is the norm, not a deviation from the norm. It's not an aberration from something. It is the already existing structure of cultural life. And I say that because I think diversity initiatives can sometimes come off as a change in the status quo. So Aunt Jemima has graced the package as a pancake mix for 130 years. Removing the image certainly seems like a change to the status quo, but it is actually bringing the brand into alignment with the racial, ethnic, and culturally diverse conditions of the American public. And advertisers had little interest in such issues when the brand was created in the 1890s and when they adopted the Mammy figure to play on white consumers' nostalgia for slavery, right? They weren't exactly concerned about what Black people thought of their packaging. And so just to give you some statistics here, what it means to say diversity is the norm, in 1880, we see that it was 86.5% white, a little over 13% Black, fraction Native American, Asian, and Hispanic percentages. But as we fast forward to the last 20 years, this graph on the right, you can see that in 2000, those numbers had already shifted where, we're talking 12.5% Latino, over 12% Black, down to 70% white, and even closer to today, it's down to 60% white, and Asian and Latino communities growing the highest in that percentage. But if we look on the last graph on the far right, what you can see is the under 16 population right now is less than 50% white. And so to say that diversity is the norm is to say that the United States is composed of diverse population. But the cultural politics question is who has been afforded the rights to participate socially, politically, and economically, and in what capacity. And this is where strategic communication comes into play. So within advertising and public relations, diversity is really picked up in three categories: the audiences, representations, and labor. Audiences being the segment of the general public with whom we are communicating on behalf of employers or clients. Representations being the words, images, and ideas we distribute through various forms of media. And labor being the demographic composition of the workforce in the industry. So that plays out in a few different ways. I think the general public's first encounter, the primary place where the general public encounters this stuff is audiences and through representation. And so advertising representation and product packaging, these are the front line which the general public encounters strategic communications role in creating diverse representations of people in corporate communication. And so the Aunt Jemima brand is exactly this. It's a representation that we constantly encounter in grocery stores and advertisements. It's part of our daily breakfast routines if we eat pancakes all the time, and it's a brand that we're loyal to. So those representations are often the front line. In terms of audiences, though, we're perhaps a little less aware of the role that audience segmentation plays in the industry, because it's not something we as consumers or audiences typically pay attention to or see in our everyday experiences. So it is still an infrastructure that shapes who sees what ads, when, where, and through which channel. And that applies to everything from if you're watching broadcast television to looking at social media. Whatever ads pop up are determined by the way that you have been segmented as a relevant audience to this particular advertiser, typically because something about your demographic that they've identified typically watches this show. And so we have to keep in mind that those media companies who create the shows that we watch and create the social media platforms that we enjoy using, they make their money by selling you as an audience. And so we don't always experience exactly how we're being segmented. And finally, labor, and this is where the general public is probably one more step removed from the demographic makeup, is that we don't see who's making these ads. It's not something that we're aware of. Whoever is making the ads is typically hidden from us. And it's worth noting that currently in the advertising industry is less than 1% Black. It's 0.7% Black. And that's a far cry from the 12.5% of the U.S. population that is Black. So it's there's a very real diversity problem in the labor pool within the industry. But if we take all of these things, the labor, the representations, and the audiences, we get to this question of who is persuading whom with what ideas. So who is persuading? And historically, what we're talking about is white advertisers persuading white audiences using ideas that are derogatory representations of Black people and communities. And so this question is a key, not just to understanding how diversity works, but how advertising works in relationship to everyday cultural life. And over time, that connection between something like the Miami figure of Aunt Jemima and the lived existence of enslaved women serving in their masters' homes becomes more and more abstracted. And so it's easy to see how a century later, consumers see the image of a smiling Black woman on a syrup bottle and think little of it because the representation is so far removed from the referent, right, or the original context that it represents. So just to show you what some of that context looks like, here's 3 iterations of the Aunt Jemima brand over the last 130 years. The 1890s original packaging, the logo and advertisements from the 1950s, and then when they redid the brand in the 1990s. And one of the things that is really easy to see is how hard they worked to create a consistent brand image of Aunt Jemima for the last 130 years, whether that's the bandana that she's wearing, her smile, her facial features, her eyebrows. And if we look really carefully, we can even see the same smile and eyebrow and like cheekbone structure moving from the 1890s to the 1950s to being slimmed down and professionalized in the 1990s when they tried to cope a little bit with the fact that they were using this very racist imagery to sell pancakes. And so they slimmed her down, gave her more professional attire, showed what her hair looked like, removed sort of the servant iconography from it. And again, we're asking who is persuading whom with what ideas. In the 1890s, we're talking about white advertisers, right? White people who owned the company using this image of an enslaved woman in order to sell pancake mix. And by the 1990s, there's a higher recognition of cultural diversity, and so they see how bad it is, and they try to tweak it in order to make it less offensive. But obviously, over the last 20 or so years, has shown that that's not enough. We need to go further. And so when it comes to working with special collections, over the last few years, I've worked with Aaliyah LeVar Wegner. She's the digital collections librarian. And we've developed different exercises for classes that I've taught using the Shields trade card and advertising collection. One is an advertising and consumer culture class that I teach, and the other is the intro to Stratcom class that my students are here today. And so in collaboration with special collections, we start with historical materials and examine how these promotional messages worked in their time in order to understand strategic communications in ours. So as some context, trade cards in the mid 1800s, they were a new advertising medium, and they remained popular well into the 20th century. And they were done with a printing process that's called chromolithography. And at the time, it was a pretty revolutionary printing technique that enabled the mass production of large-scale, cheap color printing. So imagine this black and white printed world. Everything is black and white newspapers and posters everywhere. And then all of a sudden, there's just a flood of these high quality, high color, beautifully done images floating around on these postcards everywhere. People collected them. They made scrapbooks out of them. They shared them. They organized them. It was very much, if you're looking for an analogy, the way that social media upset a lot of the standard advertising practices, in the last 15 years, because it was this new thing that people shared and interacted with. It was very much the same thing, only in the 1850s. And so on the right here, you'll see an example of what a trade card looks like. Typically, they had this illustrated front that was sometimes customized. Sometimes they were like stock photography, where they customized the messages based on who was using them. And oftentimes on the back, they would have your information, all of your sort of technical details that they would want to share. And this is actually a trade card from a Cincinnati company from the late 1800s. And so one of the things that we do is called this visual thinking strategy. And this is an image from the advertising consumer culture class a few years ago. We put students into small groups. We give them a pile of these trade cards and so these scrapbooks, and we have them organize the cards into patterns and themes and even stories that replicate the way that people would have interacted with the cards in their own day. And it's fascinating to see how people organized the cards in their trade books, what they found meaningful, and how they reorganized these advertising images to make them meaningful for themselves. Right? So that's part of the process of learning how these things operated in their own cultural context. And so one card we're talking about in terms of how they function in context and what lessons we can draw from them is this is a card from a company called JP Coats, and they're selling thread, specifically a black thread, and they're trying to highlight the benefit of this thread as that it won't fade. And so they run a series of these trade cards that show different conditions that would cause thread to fade under normal conditions. Where it gets wet and it runs, it's out in the sun too much and it gets sun bleached. And so in this card in particular, what we see is the white woman who's the property owner talking to Topsy, who's her slave girl, telling her to come in out of the rain, and Topsy replies that no, the thread is like me, I'm black. The color doesn't run, it doesn't fade. And in terms of understanding this in context, audiences would have to be aware of a couple of things here. So one, that it relies on using this trope of black skin as a temporary state that can be removed by cleaning, or in this case, wetting, and in order to become white. Right? And this trope relies on equating blackness to being dirty. And this is really common in soap advertisements. Where we see, hey, buy this soap, it'll basically wash the black off of your skin, right? And so the whole idea is there that it equates blackness to dirty and white to cleanliness, and therefore better. The second aspect of this is this caricaturized version of African American vernacular English, where Topsy's use of the English language is meant to reinforce this notion of simple-minded Black people who are unable to properly speak English. And we can see this by comparing the way the white woman's voice and Topsy's voice use a different form of English, right? And so it reinforces a social hierarchy as well as a kind of intellectual hierarchy. And finally, the character of Topsy. Topsy was the name of an enslaved girl in Harriet Beecher Stowe's influential abolitionist book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so an adult version of the character quickly made it into media like this, or traveling shows, as a figure who was always upbeat despite her circumstances. And so the character of Topsy herself would have been familiar to audiences and acted as this like racist trope about what enslaved women were like, as these kinds of always upbeat, always happy to serve their masters, right? And this is very much connected to the trope of the mammy figure. And so one of the lessons that we can draw from this is from a scholar, Marilyn Mahaffey, and she argues that depictions like Toppy or the mammy figure, like Aunt Jemima, and these trade cards are essential to creating the image of a white middle-class feminine consumer as the ideal figure in a burgeoning U.S. consumer culture. And what she means by that is, to jump backwards here, it's this woman who is the white feminine consumer who is now seen as the ideal person to buy all of these new goods and services. Because we have to understand late 18th century, late 18th century, early 19th century, 20th century, as mass production takes place in the US, there's so many more goods that are available for cheap for people to buy. And so it's the early stages of what people call a consumer culture, which is that we buy the things that we need rather than we produce the things that we need. And so for Mahaffey, it's this ideal of a white middle-class feminine consumer that becomes the ideal for the US consumer culture, but it relies on this figure of figures like Topsy or the mammy figure as like the Black women who are doing the work, freeing up the white women to become consumers. And so these kinds of representations tell us a lot about how white advertisers were using images of Black people to sell products to predominantly white audiences. So Aunt Jemima brand was created after a pair of white business owners who struggled to sell their pancake mix. They saw a minstrel show featuring a racial stereotype of a Black female caregiver devoted to her white family. That figure was Aunt Jemima, and so they created their pancake brand around the image of Aunt Jemima because they thought it would sell to white audiences who, like I mentioned earlier, were a bit nostalgic for slavery. Right? And so the next image is a bit offensive, so just a warning about that. This leads us to thinking about the afterlife of ads. So what happens to these ads, these ideas, these images, after they get distributed through advertising? How do they circulate in culture? What is their afterlife? And so one way that we can sort of unpack some of this stuff is this racist trope of Black people and watermelons. If we look back through history and we dig through some of this stuff, we can see that advertising probably played a crucial role in help creating a negative stereotype there. And so Pilgrim, who I mentioned earlier, who runs the Jim Crow Museum, he notes that the association between Black people and watermelons isn't always negative and probably worsened after emancipation. And one explanation for that is that watermelons were cultivated and sold by newly freed slaves as a means of economic empowerment. And so the adoption of the racist watermelon trope by advertisers, whether it was intentional or not, subverted efforts to gain economic independence because it propagated this trope as a means of selling goods and services. And this trope is important because it reversed the image of economic empowerment and instead propagated ideas about Black people as the lazy consumer of watermelons, right? And the watermelon being the object of desire, which alleviates all of their other political and economic strife. And so this trade card that we see here is from 1934. Right? This is how late this, we're seeing tropes like this continue to be used. And so over time, the repetition from not just this advertiser, but many others, over time, that repetition and the ubiquity of the image, it kind of sticks within the cultural imagination. And so while the trope of the watermelon didn't originate with advertisers, they definitely reinforced its legitimacy and amplified the influence of the negative stereotype simply in the name of selling products, right? And that's what we must avoid. And that's one of the lessons that I hope these kinds of exercises that I do in the classroom leave on students, kind of as a takeaway, is that those are the kinds of things that we should avoid doing, is using imageries and representations of people that are negative simply just to sell products, right? And so then some of the reactions that we see from the Pearl Milling rebrand highlight that we know brands exist within our cultural life in ways that far exceed their communicative function of selling products. I will admit that I've read some of the comments on Facebook from some of the news releases, and there's a lot of people who were very angry about the rebrand. Some people were saying that it took away like their childhood memories because they have fond memories of having the syrup as a kid. Other people were telling these fabricated stories about how they're removing one of the first Black millionaire women in America, which is entirely a falsehood because the character isn't real. They were making up the story as if Aunt Jemima was the founder of the business. And so, it's no accident, all right, that Pepsi announced the overhaul of the Aunt Jemima brand in June of 2000 in the wake of the national outcry over the killing of George Floyd. And in fact, in 2017, just a few years before, Quaker and Pepsi had declined a change.org petition to remove Aunt Jemima from the product, saying, quote, Aunt Jemima was a wholesome character and they didn't feel the need to change the brand. So fast forward just a few years and the context changes, public outcry changes, and there begins to be an increasing recognition by some of these big companies to go back and reassess some of this stuff. And this is where I think teaching about the history is really important because that is a thing that's not going away. That's a trend in the industry that's not going away. That reassessment and looking at the history of these big, long-standing brands is something that we need to understand. We need to be trained and able to think through. And so, again, to reinforce this question of what ideas and to whom, how many advertising taglines, catchphrases, and jingles do we have that are kicking around in our heads all the time? And so these are part of our everyday life. We reference them, we think about them. Even if we want to deny that advertising has any effect on us, it constantly reinforces the ideas that consumption, buying this product is an outlet for your desire. And here's the little catchphrase or the tag or the icon or the logo that's going to reinforce that for you. And so I want to touch on briefly on this one campaign from 2007 from Geico, because it speaks to exactly the issue that we're talking about here. And so the campaign was So Easy a Caveman Can Do It. When it started in 2007, and it's premised on the audience knowing how problematic and simplistic degrading representations are to the people being represented. And so the campaign unfolds over a few years in a series of ads in which the image you see on the right here is one of the cavemen seeing an advertisement, this negative representation of himself as being this so stupid essentially and simple-minded, and taking offense to it. And as the campaign evolves, there's a commercial where the Geico spokesman has a sit-down meeting and he apologizes with a couple of the cavemen. And he says at one point, "We didn't even think you guys were still around," which is essentially to say, we know what we're saying is offensive. We just never thought the offended party would see it. And the campaign essentially came to an end after ABC tried to develop a pilot on the cavemen commercials. It was in which the cavemen would battle prejudices in the modern world. It didn't make it past the pilot stage. But my point in bringing this up is that audiences know that these kinds of representations are problematic. Otherwise, a campaign like that wouldn't work. And the gag wouldn't work. Its humor wouldn't land. And so if it works as a punchline, this idea that representations matter, it could also be used to repair how things work, right? This is the sort of premise of what ideas and with whom. And so this for the sanitized Aunt Jemima from the 1990s, it might seem pretty benign today, but its history is never lost. It's only more obscured. And so when advertisers and brands choose to use imagery that at one time signaled and relied upon the oppression of one people by another, it's the responsibility of the next generation of advertisers and public relations professionals to transform rather than reproduce those ideas, to be mindful of their effects on the public, the audiences, and the communities that they're meant to serve. So I want to reinforce it, especially to my students here, like it's an act of power to create advertisements because it demonstrates norms, it amplifies ideas, it reinforces assumptions. And every time we create an ad, we're actively choosing to reinforce or transform how the audience makes sense out of the world, right? There's a real obligation there. There's some real ethics there. And so if we think about this back to what I said earlier about diversity being the norm and disrupting the status quo, the rebranding of Aunt Jemima into Pearl Milling is no doubt a disruption in the continuity of how consumers experience the product. But as we've already seen, there have been several changes to the Aunt Jemima figures over the years. So why do audiences and consumers feel invested in the status quo? And so while critics of the rebrand see it as an encroachment by the cancel culture left onto a beloved brand icon, disrupting their status quo, a bit more historical perspective reveals that the status quo is built on imagery, which perpetuated ideas that it was normal for Black women to be enslaved or in servitude through stereotypes of the mammy figure, to sell pancakes. And if we can't step back and see the absurdity of that for a moment, then what are we doing, So while the brand disrupts the status quo, it uses a kind of history that I discussed with the trade cards in order to realign which ideas are used to promote products today in more diverse and inclusive ways. So I want to conclude here with just 3 points about sort of moving forward as a strategic communications industry. Audiences, right? So today, social media, customer review forums, and hosts of other possibilities enable interaction between customers and brands that highlights the connection between companies and diverse publics it sells its products to. And while there's much to be skeptical about social media, it can have the benefit of enabling otherwise silenced or ostracized voices to be included in our shared consumer culture. And so a lot of the response we've seen last summer by companies like Aunt Jemima's, Uncle Ben's, what they're doing is they're responding to the voices that are being heard online, right? And so there's a real possibility to interact with companies and make your voices heard in that way that didn't exist in the era of the trade cards, didn't exist in the 1950s because through television, and honestly didn't really exist so much into the 90s until we see the rise of social media. Another area is representations, and that is where strategic communications professionals must take seriously the ideas and history reproduced by brand imagery and work toward more intentionally positive representations, displaying cultural depth, not stereotypes or superficial assumptions. So it's very much about going back and looking at what we're doing, moving forward, not through the easiest path, right? Not through our own assumptions about how things work, but actually talking to these, and if you're going to represent those communities on behalf of company, right, to sell a product, that it's not in a stereotypical way, right, that you're not making superficial assumptions, that there's a real depth to that. And finally, labor. Right? The industry needs to do a lot more to increase diversity in the workforce by removing barriers to entry and advancements for people of color. Like I said, 0.7% of the industry is Black. And so for a broader picture of what those aims look like, last summer, there was over 600 professionals drafted an open letter to the advertising industry. We're talking professionals from like top agencies from all over the country. And in there's a list of like 12 points that things that they want to see change in the industry. And they're all centered around making it easier for people of color to get hired and to advance in the industry. So with that, I'd like to thank Jackie again for inviting me to come and share what we've been doing. So thank you very much.